The millionaire's daughter wasn't deaf. The janitor, single father, uncovered the cruel truth her mother had ignored. Before we start, I love seeing this community grow. Feel free to introduce yourself below. The marble floors of the Richardson mansion gleamed under Marcus Thompson's methodical cleaning, each surface reflecting a life of luxury he'd never known. At 35, with calloused hands and a back that ached from years of janitor work, he moved through the opulent rooms with practiced efficiency. His own 7-year-old daughter Emma waited for him at their cramped apartment, probably doing homework at their rickety kitchen table. "Mr. Thompson, please be extra quiet in the study today," whispered Patricia Richardson, the 27-year-old tech mogul whose software company had made her millions before 30. Her designer heels clicked nervously against the hardwood as she adjusted her silk blouse. "Sophie is having her therapy session." Marcus nodded, glancing toward the soundproofed room where Sophie Richardson, Patricia's 7-year-old daughter, sat with Dr. Amanda Sterling, a renowned child psychologist who specialized in deaf children. Through the glass door, he watched the beautiful little girl with golden curls respond to sign language with mechanical precision, her blue eyes distant and eerily calm. "How long has Sophie been working with Dr. Sterling?" Marcus asked, wringing out his mop. Patricia's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "Since she was 18 months old. We discovered her condition very early." She paused, her manicured fingers fidgeting with her pearl necklace. "The doctor said early intervention was crucial. Dr. Sterling comes 3 times a week, plus we have occupational therapy on Tuesdays and speech therapy on Fridays, though that's mostly to help her understand lip reading." Marcus had cleaned the Richardson mansion for 3 months now, and something about Sophie had always bothered him. Not bothered in a negative way, but puzzled him in a way that kept him awake some nights. The child moved through the house like a ghost, perfectly behaved, never making noise, never causing trouble. She ate her meals in silence, played with expensive educational toys in silence, and interacted with her mother through a complex system of signs that seemed more like choreographed movements than natural communication. "She's very well behaved," Marcus offered, hoping to sound supportive. "She has to be," Patricia said sharply, then caught herself. "I mean, her condition requires structure, routine, predictability." Her phone buzzed with what Marcus had learned was her typical endless stream of business calls. "I need to take this. Please just stay out of the study area today." As Patricia disappeared into her home office, Marcus continued his work, but his attention kept drifting to the study. Sophie sat perfectly still as Dr. Sterling showed her flashcards, her small hands forming signs with robotic precision. There was something about the child's posture, something about the way she held her shoulders that reminded Marcus of his own daughter Emma when she was pretending to be asleep after bedtime stories. During his lunch break, Marcus sat in the mansion's immaculate garden, eating a sandwich from his metal lunchbox. The landscaping was magazine perfect, but he noticed Sophie never played outside. In fact, in 3 months of working here, he'd never seen the child run, laugh, or display any of the chaotic joy that made his own daughter such a handful. His phone rang. "Daddy, when are you coming home?" Emma's voice bubbled with excitement. "I learned a new song in music class today, and Mrs. Patterson said I have the prettiest voice in the whole 2nd grade. I'll be home by 6, sweetheart. Can't wait to hear your song." "It goes like this." Emma burst into an enthusiastic, slightly off-key rendition of "Somewhere Over the Rainbow," complete with dramatic arm gestures that Marcus could visualize perfectly. As he listened to his daughter's joyful noise, Marcus found himself thinking about Sophie's profound silence. Emma had been chattering non-stop since she was 18 months old, asking endless questions, singing constantly, laughing at her own jokes. Even when she was concentrating intensely on homework or drawing, she hummed or whispered to herself. After ending the call, Marcus walked back toward the house and passed by the study window. Dr. Sterling was packing up her materials, and Sophie sat in her chair with that same unnaturally perfect posture. But as Marcus watched, something extraordinary happened. A blue jay landed on the windowsill behind Sophie, and for just a moment, the little girl's head turned slightly. Not enough to be obvious, but enough that Marcus, who had spent years watching his own daughter's micro-expressions, noticed the subtle movement. Sophie's eyes had definitely tracked toward the sound. Marcus froze, his cleaning supplies forgotten in his hands. He waited, watching carefully. "Doctor." Sterling dropped her pen, and again Sophie's eyes flickered just for a split second toward the sound. "Interesting," Marcus murmured to himself. When Dr. Sterling emerged from the study 15 minutes later, she barely acknowledged Marcus as she spoke with Patricia in the foyer. "Sophie's progress continues to be steady, Doctor," Sterling said in her professional tone. "Her sign language comprehension is excellent, and her behavioral responses are exactly where we want them to be for a child with her level of hearing impairment." "No changes in her condition?" Patricia asked, and Marcus thought he detected a strange tension in her voice. "None whatsoever. Sophie remains profoundly deaf, exactly as diagnosed. I'll see you Thursday." After Dr. Sterling left, Patricia disappeared upstairs to her conference calls, leaving Sophie alone in the study. Marcus continued cleaning nearby, stealing glances at the little girl who sat motionless in her chair, staring at nothing. Then Marcus did something he'd never done before. He deliberately dropped his scrub brush, letting it clatter loudly against the marble floor just outside the study door. Sophie's head turned. Not dramatically, not obviously, but her head definitely turned toward the sound. Her blue eyes met Marcus's through the doorway for just a moment before she quickly looked away, her small body tensing as if she'd been caught doing something forbidden. Marcus's heart began to race. He picked up his brush slowly, his mind reeling with implications he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Either he'd just witnessed something that contradicted years of medical diagnoses and expensive therapy, or his imagination was playing cruel tricks on him. But deep in his gut, Marcus knew what he'd seen. And if he was right, it meant that everything about Sophie Richardson's life was built on a lie. The question that terrified him was simple. Did Patricia know? Marcus Thompson spent the entire weekend thinking about what he'd witnessed in the Richardson mansion. He'd barely slept, playing the scene over and over in his mind, second-guessing himself, wondering if he'd imagined the whole thing. By Monday morning, he'd almost convinced himself it was wishful thinking. After all, what did a janitor know about diagnosing deafness that teams of medical professionals didn't? But as he prepared breakfast for Emma, watching his daughter chatter excitedly about her upcoming school play, he couldn't shake the image of Sophie's subtle head turn. Emma's natural, unconscious responses to every sound around her, the coffee maker beeping, the neighbor's dog barking, a car honking outside, made Sophie's calculated stillness seem even more unnatural. "Daddy, you're burning the eggs," Emma giggled, pointing at the stove where smoke was beginning to rise from the pan. "Sorry, sweetheart." Daddy's mind was somewhere else. Marcus quickly rescued breakfast and sat down across from his chatty daughter. "Emma, can I ask you something? If you were pretending to be asleep, but you heard me coming up the stairs, what would you do?" Emma scrunched up her freckled nose, considering the question with the seriousness that 7-year-olds brought to hypotheticals. "Well, I'd have to not move at all, even if I heard you. But it would be really, really hard, because I'd want to peek and see if you were bringing me water or checking if I was okay." She took a big bite of eggs. "Why? Are you trying to catch me pretending to sleep?" "No, baby, just curious." But Emma's answer confirmed what Marcus suspected. Even when pretending, children instinctively react to sounds. The conscious effort to not respond was almost harder to maintain than natural responses. When Marcus arrived at the Richardson mansion that morning, he was greeted by an unusual scene. Patricia stood in the foyer arguing in hushed, tense tones with a distinguished man in an expensive suit, someone Marcus had never seen before. "Absolutely cannot discuss this now, Richard. Sophie has therapy in an hour, and I have 3 board calls scheduled before lunch. Patricia, you can't keep avoiding this conversation forever. The trust stipulations are clear, and the trustees are asking questions. Sophie's condition, her care costs, the specialized schooling, All of this affects the financial distributions. They want updated medical documentation. Patricia noticed Marcus and immediately shifted her tone. Mr. Thompson, please start with the guest wing today. The main floor needs to be completely finished before 10:30. As Marcus headed toward the guest wing, he caught fragments of the conversation continuing in the library. 7 years of medical expenses. Dr. Sterling's reports have always been consistent, but if there were any changes in diagnosis, any improvements, there won't be any changes, Richard. Sophie's condition is permanent. The trust distributions continue as arranged. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Trust distributions. Financial arrangements tied to Sophie's disability. He tried to focus on his work, but the implications of what he'd overheard were deeply troubling. An hour later, Dr. Sterling arrived for Sophie's session. Marcus was cleaning the hallway outside the study when he heard Patricia's voice through the door. "Doctor, I need to ask you something confidential. Hypothetically, if a child who had been diagnosed with profound deafness were to show any signs of improved hearing, what would be the proper protocol?" There was a pause. "Well, that would be extraordinary, Patricia. In Sophie's case, given the nature of her diagnosis and the consistency of her responses over 6 years, any change would require immediate, comprehensive testing. We'd need new audiograms, neural response testing, possibly even surgical consultation to understand what had changed. And you'd be obligated to report such changes to other professionals, insurance, government agencies. Of course, any significant change in a child's medical status requires proper documentation and reporting. Why do you ask? Have you noticed something different about Sophie?" No, just curious about protocols. You know how I like to understand every aspect of Sophie's care." Marcus continued cleaning, but his hands were shaking slightly. The conversation confirmed his growing suspicions. Patricia was asking about protocols because she was worried about something she thought might need to be hidden. During Sophie's therapy session, Marcus positioned himself where he could observe without being obvious. "Doctor." Sterling went through her usual routine of flashcards, sign language exercises, and behavioral assessments. Sophie responded with her typical mechanical precision, but Marcus was watching for something different now. Dr. Sterling deliberately knocked over a cup of pencils behind Sophie's back. The little girl didn't turn around. But Marcus noticed something Dr. Sterling missed. Sophie's shoulders had tensed slightly, and her breathing had changed. 20 minutes later, when Dr. Sterling stepped out to use the bathroom, Marcus made his move. He walked past the study doorway, and when he was sure no one else was around, he whispered very softly, "Sophie." The little girl's eyes immediately snapped to his face. For a moment, they stared at each other, and Marcus saw something in those blue eyes that broke his heart. Fear. Not the confusion of a child who couldn't hear, but the terror of a child who had been caught breaking rules she didn't understand. "It's okay," Marcus whispered even softer. "I won't tell anyone." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly looked away and resumed her perfectly still posture just as Dr. Sterling returned to the room. That afternoon, after Dr. Sterling left, Marcus found himself alone in the house with Sophie, while Patricia conducted a conference call upstairs. He approached the study carefully, his heart pounding. Sophie sat in her usual chair, but when she saw him, her small frame trembled. Marcus knelt down to her level, still several feet away, and spoke in the softest whisper he could manage. "Sophie, my name is Marcus. I have a little girl just like you. Her name is Emma." He paused, watching her carefully. "I think you can hear me, sweetheart, and I think you've been very, very scared for a long time." A single tear rolled down Sophie's cheek, but she didn't move or make a sound. "I don't know why you have to pretend, but I want you to know that you're not alone anymore. Someone sees you, someone knows the truth." Sophie's lips parted slightly, and Marcus thought she might speak, but footsteps on the stairs made her freeze again. By the time Patricia appeared in the doorway, Sophie had resumed her vacant stare, and Marcus was innocently dusting a bookshelf. "Mr. Thompson, is everything all right? You seem to be spending a lot of time in this area today. Just being thorough, Mum. This room has a lot of delicate items that require careful attention. Patricia studied his face for a moment, her green eyes sharp and calculating. Indeed, Sophie's space requires special care. I trust you understand the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries. Of course, Mrs. Richardson. But as Patricia turned to leave, Marcus saw Sophie's reflection in the window glass behind her. The little girl was watching her mother with an expression that chilled Marcus to the bone. It wasn't the blank stare of a disabled child. It was the wary, calculating look of someone much older, someone who knew secrets. And in that moment, Marcus realized that Sophie Richardson wasn't just a victim of medical misdiagnosis. She was a prisoner in her own home, trapped by circumstances he couldn't yet understand. The question was no longer whether Sophie could hear. The question was why everyone in her life needed her to pretend she couldn't. Marcus Thompson's discovery consumed his thoughts for the next 3 days. He found himself studying child development articles online after Emma went to bed, researching selective mutism, psychological trauma, and the long-term effects of forcing children to hide their abilities. What he learned made him sick to his stomach. Wednesday morning brought an unexpected development. As Marcus arrived at the Richardson mansion, he noticed an unfamiliar black sedan in the circular driveway. Through the front windows, he could see Patricia pacing frantically in her office while speaking on the phone, her usual composure completely shattered. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly housekeeper who worked part-time for the Richardsons, met Marcus at the service entrance. Her weathered face was creased with worry. "Oh, Marcus, thank goodness you're here. Mrs. Richardson is having some kind of crisis. Been on the phone since 6 this morning, and she's cancelled all of Sophie's appointments for the week. Even Dr. Sterling's sessions. Is Sophie all right?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "The poor little thing is locked in her room. Mrs. Richardson said she's not feeling well, but—" Mrs. Henderson lowered her voice. "I've been caring for children for 40 years, Marcus. That little girl isn't sick. She's terrified." Marcus felt his protective instincts kick into overdrive. "Have you tried talking to Mrs. Richardson about it?" "I've worked for wealthy families long enough to know when to mind my own business," Mrs. Henderson said sadly. "But sometimes minding your own business feels an awful lot like being a coward." As Marcus began his work, he could hear Patricia's voice echoing from her office, fragments of urgent conversations drifting through the mansion. "Told you this could never happen. 6 years of careful management. Trust fund disbursements are contingent on—" "If anyone suspects the truth." The black sedan belonged to Richard Whitman, Patricia's attorney, who had been in heated discussions with her since early morning. Around 10 o'clock, another car arrived, a silver Mercedes that Marcus recognized as belonging to Dr. Sterling. "Patricia, your message was quite alarming," Dr. Sterling said as she hurried into Patricia's office. "You said there might be complications with Sophie's case." Marcus positioned himself in the hallway, pretending to polish a side table while straining to hear the conversation. "Someone might have questions about Sophie's diagnosis," Patricia said carefully. "I need to know our options if that happens." "What kind of questions?" "Patricia, Sophie's case is thoroughly documented. I've been treating her for 6 years. Her profound deafness is well established. But if someone claimed to observe inconsistencies in her behavior, what would that mean legally? For the trust arrangements?" There was a long pause. "Patricia, are you suggesting that someone thinks Sophie might not be deaf? Because that would be impossible." "I've conducted comprehensive evaluations." "Just answer the question, Amanda. Hypothetically," Dr. Sterling's voice became more cautious. "Hypothetically, if there were questions about the validity of Sophie's diagnosis, it would trigger immediate investigation by Child Protective Services, the State Medical Board, and potentially the District Attorney's Office if fraud was suspected. The financial implications alone would be staggering." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. Child Protective Services, fraud investigation. He was beginning to understand the massive conspiracy he had accidentally uncovered. And if someone were to make such accusations without absolute proof, Patricia pressed, they would need compelling evidence. Accusations of medical fraud are serious. False reporting could result in defamation charges, especially against someone with your resources and legal representation. After Dr. Sterling left, Marcus found himself alone with Mrs. Henderson in the kitchen. The older woman was preparing lunch with shaking hands. "Mrs. Henderson," Marcus said gently, "can I ask you something? How long have you worked for the Richardson family?" "I started when Sophie was 2 years old, right after Mrs. Richardson's mother passed away." She paused, her expression growing troubled. "That's when everything changed for that family." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Henderson glanced around nervously before continuing. "Mrs. Richardson's mother, Elizabeth Richardson, left a very specific trust fund for Sophie, millions of dollars, but with strict conditions. The money could only be accessed for medical care, special education and support services if Sophie had a documented disability. If Sophie were typical, the trust would go to charity instead. Marcus felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. So, if Sophie weren't disabled, Mrs. Richardson would lose access to millions of dollars that currently fund their lifestyle. The mansion, the cars, the private schooling, all the medical appointments. It all comes from Sophie's trust fund. Mrs. Richardson's tech company is successful, but not wealthy enough to maintain this level of luxury. "But surely a medical diagnosis couldn't be faked for 6 years, Marcus said, though even as he spoke, he was thinking about Dr. Sterling's consistent reports, the isolated therapy sessions, the way Sophie never interacted with other children or teachers who might question her condition. Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a long moment. "I've watched that little girl for 5 years, Marcus. I've seen things that troubled me, but Mrs. Richardson is a powerful woman and I'm just a housekeeper. Who would believe me?" "What kind of things?" "Sophie responds to sounds when she thinks no one is watching. She mouths words silently when she reads. Once, I saw her dancing in her room to music from her tablet, and she was keeping perfect time with the rhythm." Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with tears. "That baby is living a lie, and I've been too afraid to speak up." That afternoon, while Patricia remained locked in crisis meetings with her attorney, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He climbed the curved staircase to the second floor and found Sophie's room. The door was closed but not locked. He knocked softly and heard Patricia call from downstairs. "Sophie needs to rest, Mr. Thompson. Please leave her alone." But Marcus had heard something else, a very quiet, very young voice whispering, "Come in." Sophie Richardson sat cross-legged on her pink canopy bed, surrounded by expensive toys she never played with and educational materials designed for deaf children. When she saw Marcus, her blue eyes filled with desperate hope. "Hi, Sophie," Marcus whispered. "My name is Marcus, remember? I think we need to talk." For the first time in years, Sophie Richardson spoke aloud. "Please help me," she whispered, her voice hoarse from years of silence. "I want to talk to someone. I want to go to real school. I want to have friends." Tears streamed down her face. "But Mommy says I can never ever tell anyone that I can hear, or terrible things will happen to both of us." Marcus knelt beside her bed, his heart breaking for this little girl who had been forced to live in silence to protect her mother's financial security. What kind of terrible things did she say would happen? Sophie's voice dropped to barely audible. "She said if anyone found out I could hear, the police would take me away forever, and she would go to jail, and it would be all my fault because I couldn't keep the secret." She looked at Marcus with eyes far too old for her 7-year-old face. "But I don't understand why it has to be a secret. I just want to be normal." At that moment, Marcus heard footsteps on the stairs. Patricia's voice echoed through the house. "Mr. Thompson, where are you?" Sophie immediately fell silent and assumed the blank stare Marcus had become accustomed to seeing. But now he knew the truth. Sophie Richardson was not deaf, disabled, or delayed. She was a bright, articulate 7-year-old girl who had been psychologically imprisoned by her own mother to maintain access to millions of dollars in trust fund money, and Marcus Thompson, a simple janitor who just wanted to do the right thing, now held the power to either save Sophie Richardson or destroy everything she had ever known. As Patricia's footsteps grew closer, Marcus faced the most important decision of his life. He could walk away, pretend he had never discovered the truth, and let Sophie continue living her silent lie, or he could fight for a little girl who had been silenced by the very person who should have been her strongest voice. But with powerful people, expensive lawyers, and millions of dollars at stake, Marcus knew that choosing to help Sophie would put both of them in incredible danger. Patricia Richardson's heels clicked ominously as she climbed the stairs, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Mr. Thompson, I specifically asked you not to disturb Sophie today. She needs complete rest." Marcus emerged from Sophie's room, closing the door gently behind him. His heart pounded as he faced the woman who had orchestrated 6 years of psychological abuse against her own daughter. "I apologize, Mrs. Richardson. I heard what I thought might be a noise and wanted to ensure Sophie was safe." Patricia's green eyes narrowed, studying his face with the calculating precision that had made her a successful CEO. "What kind of noise?" "Just movement. But she appears to be resting peacefully." Marcus forced himself to maintain eye contact, knowing that any sign of deception could be catastrophic for Sophie. "I see." Patricia stepped closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Mr. Thompson, I've been thinking about our arrangement. Perhaps it's time for a change. I'm considering hiring a different cleaning service, one with more established protocols for working around special needs children." The threat was clear. Marcus felt sweat beading on his forehead, but he kept his voice steady. "I understand your concerns, ma'am. I've always tried to be respectful of Sophie's needs." "Have you?" Patricia tilted her head. "Because lately I've noticed you paying unusual attention to Sophie's area of the house, almost as if you're observing her." Before Marcus could respond, the doorbell rang. Patricia's face went pale. "That will be Child Protective Services," she said, her voice suddenly brittle. "Someone called in a complaint about Sophie's care." "Anonymous tip," they said. Her eyes locked on Marcus with laser intensity. "I can't imagine who would do such a thing." Marcus felt his stomach drop. Someone had called CPS, but it wasn't him. Who else knew about Sophie's situation? Downstairs, Mrs. Henderson answered the door, admitting a professional-looking woman in her 40s carrying a briefcase and official identification. "Good afternoon. I'm Sarah Chen, caseworker with Child Protective Services. We received a report of potential medical neglect involving a child named Sophie Richardson." Patricia descended the stairs with practiced composure, her business mask firmly in place. "Ms. Chen, I'm Patricia Richardson. I assume there's been some misunderstanding. Sophie receives excellent medical care from top specialists." "I'm sure she does, Mrs. Richardson. This is just routine follow-up. May I speak with Sophie and observe her in her normal environment?" "Of course, though I should warn you that Sophie is profoundly deaf. She communicates through sign language and can be overwhelmed by strangers." Marcus watched this exchange from the second-floor landing, his mind racing. If Sarah Chen conducted a proper assessment, she might notice the same inconsistencies he had observed, but she might also be fooled by Sophie's 6 years of practiced deception. 20 minutes later, Marcus observed through a crack in the door as Sarah Chen sat with Sophie in the study. The caseworker spoke normally while making notes, occasionally signing basic phrases. Sophie responded with her typical mechanical sign language, her face blank and unresponsive. But Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. Sophie's responses were too perfect. Real deaf children learning sign language made mistakes, showed frustration, had individual quirks in their signing style. Sophie signed like someone who had been drilled and rehearsed, not like someone naturally acquiring language. Sarah Chen seemed satisfied. "Sophie appears well cared for physically. Her signing is quite advanced for her age. However, I'd like to schedule a follow-up visit next month, and I'll need current medical records from her specialists. Absolutely, Patricia said smoothly. Dr. Sterling can provide comprehensive documentation of Sophie's progress. After Sarah Chen left, Patricia's composed facade crumbled. She stormed into her office and began making frantic phone calls. Amanda, we have a problem. CPS just conducted an assessment. I need you to review all of Sophie's records and make sure every detail is perfect. No, I don't know who called them, but someone suspects something. Marcus continued his work, but his mind was elsewhere. He needed to understand more about Sophie's situation before deciding how to help her. That evening, he made a decision that could change everything. After finishing work, instead of going straight home, Marcus drove to the public library. He spent 3 hours researching the Richardson family, Patricia's business holdings, and most importantly, Elizabeth Richardson's trust fund. What he discovered was staggering. Elizabeth Richardson had died 7 years ago, leaving a $50 million trust fund specifically for Sophie's care. The trust documents, which were public record, contained very specific language. Funds could only be accessed if Sophie had a documented permanent disability requiring ongoing medical intervention and specialized education. But there was more. If Sophie were ever determined to be neurotypical and capable of mainstream education, the entire trust would be donated to the National Association for Deaf Children, and Patricia would lose all access to the funds. Marcus found newspaper articles from 7 years ago documenting Elizabeth Richardson's death and the unusual trust provisions. One quote from Patricia stood out: "My mother wanted to ensure that Sophie would always be protected and provided for, regardless of her special needs. This trust guarantees that Sophie will receive the best possible care throughout her life." The timeline was damning. Elizabeth Richardson died when Sophie was 6 months old. Patricia claimed Sophie's deafness was discovered at 18 months, but Marcus found something else. Sophie's birth certificate listed her as a healthy full-term infant with no noted complications. His phone rang, interrupting his research. It was Emma. "Daddy, where are you? Mrs. Martinez made dinner for us, but I saved you some mac and cheese." "I'm at the library, sweetheart. I'll be home soon." "Are you doing homework like me?" Emma giggled. "What are you studying?" Marcus looked at the computer screen filled with legal documents and medical fraud statutes. "I'm learning about how to help someone who needs a friend." "That's nice, Daddy. You're really good at helping people." As Marcus drove home, Emma's innocent words echoed in his mind. He had spent his life helping people in small ways, cleaning their homes, fixing minor problems, being reliable and trustworthy. But Sophie Richardson needed help on a scale he'd never attempted. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the Richardson mansion to find police cars in the driveway. Detective Robert Hayes, a stern-looking man in his 50s, was speaking with Patricia on the front porch. "Mrs. Richardson, we've received allegations that your daughter may not actually be deaf and that you've been fraudulently claiming disability benefits. These are serious charges." Patricia's lawyer, Richard Whitman, stood beside her. "Detective, these allegations are baseless and slanderous. Sophie Richardson has been under continuous medical care since infancy. Her condition is thoroughly documented. Nevertheless, we'll need to conduct our own evaluation with independent medical professionals." Marcus felt a mixture of relief and terror. Someone else was investigating, but Sophie was about to be thrust into the center of a legal battle that could destroy her psychologically. As he entered through the service entrance, Mrs. Henderson grabbed his arm. "Marcus, Dr. Sterling left 20 minutes ago, and she was furious. She kept saying something about maintaining consistency and protecting the integrity of the case. I think they're planning something." Marcus's blood ran cold. If Patricia and Dr. Sterling were coordinating their story, Sophie might be coached even more intensively to maintain her deception. The little girl who had begged him for help could be forced deeper into her psychological prison. He made a decision that terrified him. That afternoon, while Patricia dealt with lawyers and police interviews, Marcus approached Sophie's room again. This time, he didn't knock. Sophie sat on her bed, tears streaming down her face, holding a tablet showing pictures of children playing at a regular school playground. "Sophie," Marcus whispered, "do you want to tell the truth?" She looked up at him with desperate hope. "Can I? Will you help me?" "Yes, sweetheart. But you need to understand that telling the truth is going to change everything. Your life will be completely different." Sophie wiped her tears. "Different how?" Marcus knelt beside her bed. "You'll be able to go to real school, make real friends, talk and laugh and sing whenever you want. But your mother might get in trouble, and you might have to live somewhere else for a while. Will I still be able to see her?" Marcus's heart broke. Even after years of psychological abuse, Sophie still loved her mother. "I don't know, honey, but I promise you this. Whatever happens, there are people who will make sure you're safe and loved." Sophie was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke with a maturity that stunned Marcus. "I love my mommy, but I'm tired of pretending. I want to be myself." She looked directly at Marcus. "Will you stay with me when I tell the truth? I'm scared." Before Marcus could answer, they heard Patricia's voice in the hallway, speaking urgently on her phone. "No, the police evaluation cannot happen. Sophie isn't emotionally prepared for that kind of scrutiny. We need to delay until after Dr. Sterling can properly prepare her." "What do you mean it's too late?" Marcus and Sophie exchanged glances. The moment of truth was approaching faster than either of them had expected, and Marcus realized that in the next few hours he would either save Sophie Richardson's childhood or become complicit in the destruction of everything she had ever known. The independent medical evaluation was scheduled for the following morning, and Marcus could feel the tension in the Richardson mansion reaching a breaking point. Patricia had been on emergency calls with her legal team until 3 a.m., and Dr. Sterling had arrived at 6 a.m. for what she called crisis intervention therapy with Sophie. Marcus arrived early, using his key to enter through the service entrance. The house felt different, charged with desperation and fear. Through the study door, he could hear Dr. Sterling's voice, more intense than he'd ever heard it. "Sophie, tomorrow is very important. The doctors who examine you won't understand your special needs like I do. They might try to confuse you, make you think you hear sounds that aren't really there. But you and I know the truth, don't we? You're deaf, and you need my help to communicate with the world." Marcus positioned himself where he could see into the study. Sophie sat rigidly in her chair, but her small hands were clenched into fists. For the first time in their sessions, she looked resistant. "The doctors might use very loud noises to try to trick you," Dr. Sterling continued. "But remember, you can't hear anything. Even if your body wants to react, you must stay perfectly still. Can you promise me that?" Sophie nodded, but Marcus saw something in her posture that hadn't been there before. She was done cooperating. After Dr. Sterling left, Patricia called Marcus into her office. Her usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, her eyes rimmed with red from lack of sleep. "Mr. Thompson, I want to be transparent with you about tomorrow's evaluation. Sophie is going to be subjected to very stressful medical tests. She may seem confused or distressed, but that's normal for a child with her condition. I need to know that you understand the importance of stability during this difficult time." Marcus met her gaze steadily. "I understand that Sophie's well-being is the most important thing." Patricia's eyes sharpened. "Exactly. Sophie's well-being depends on maintaining her routine, her treatment plan, and her sense of security. Any disruption to that could be traumatic for her." Indeed, it was a threat wrapped in concern for the child, but Marcus heard it clearly. "Don't interfere, or Sophie will suffer the consequences." That afternoon, while Patricia attended emergency meetings with her legal team, Marcus found Sophie in the garden for the first time since he'd started working there. She stood perfectly still near the rose bushes, but tears were streaming down her face. Marcus approached carefully, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "Sophie, what's wrong?" "Tomorrow, they're going to try to make me prove I can't hear," she whispered, her voice broken with despair. "Doctor, Sterling said I have to be perfect, or terrible things will happen to Mommy and me." "What kind of terrible things?" "She said the new doctors might hurt me with loud noises, and if I react, they'll take me away from Mommy forever. But if I don't react, I can stay home and keep being safe." Sophie looked up at Marcus with eyes far too old for 7 years. "But I don't feel safe anymore. I feel like I'm drowning in the quiet." Marcus knelt down to her level. "Sophie, what if I told you that the doctors tomorrow want to help you, not hurt you? What if telling the truth could make you safer, not less safe?" "But Dr. Sterling said." "Dr. Sterling has been lying to you, sweetheart. The truth is, you have the right to hear and speak and be yourself, and tomorrow might be your only chance to break free." Sophie was quiet for a long moment. "Will you be there?" "I don't think they'll let me be in the room, but I'll be as close as I can." "And Sophie?" Marcus waited until she met his eyes. "Whatever you decide to do tomorrow, I want you to know that you're brave and strong and deserving of a real life." That evening, Marcus made a phone call that would change everything. He contacted Detective Hayes directly. "Detective, this is Marcus Thompson. I work at the Richardson Mansion, and I have information about Sophie Richardson that you need to hear before tomorrow's evaluation." "Mr. Thompson, this is highly irregular. You shouldn't be contacting me directly about an ongoing investigation." "Sir, I know this is unusual, but that little girl's life depends on someone telling the truth. Sophie Richardson is not deaf. She's been forced to pretend for 6 years to protect her mother's access to a $50 million trust fund." There was a long pause. "That's a very serious accusation, Mr. Thompson. Do you have proof?" "I have witnessed her responding to sounds, speaking clearly and begging for help. She's terrified of tomorrow's evaluation because she's been coached to fool the doctors." "Can you document any of this?" Marcus thought about his phone, about the possibility of recording Sophie speaking. But he realized that betraying her trust by secretly recording her would be just another form of abuse. "Detective, I can't prove it to you over the phone, but I'm asking you to ensure that tomorrow's evaluation is conducted in a way that gives Sophie the freedom to tell the truth without fear of punishment." The next morning, the Richardson mansion was invaded by medical professionals, legal representatives, and court officials. Dr. Patricia Reeves, a renowned independent audiologist, arrived with a team of specialists who would conduct the most comprehensive evaluation Sophie had ever undergone. Marcus was not allowed inside during the evaluation, but Mrs. Henderson provided updates throughout the morning. "They've been in there for 2 hours, she whispered during her coffee break. "I could hear some of the testing through the walls. Lots of equipment, beeping sounds, voices." At noon, Mrs. Henderson's expression was grim. Sophie came out for a bathroom break and she looked broken, like she was fighting some kind of internal war. Marcus's heart ached. Sophie was being forced to choose between the only life she'd ever known and the freedom to be herself. For a 7-year-old, that was an impossible burden. At 2 p.m., something changed. Marcus was cleaning windows in the front hallway when he heard a sound he'd never heard in the Richardson mansion. A child's voice, clear and strong, echoing from the study. "I can hear you. I can hear everything. I've been pretending for so long, but I'm tired of pretending." "Hello." The sound of Sophie's voice, raised in desperate honesty, was followed by chaos. Shouting voices, Patricia's screams of denial, Dr. Sterling's frantic explanations, and underneath it all, Sophie crying. Not the silent tears Marcus had seen before, but the loud, messy sobs of a child finally allowed to express her emotions. 20 minutes later, the study door opened, and Dr. Reeves emerged with a grim expression. Behind her, Detective Hayes escorted Patricia Richardson, who was arguing frantically. "This is a mistake. Sophie is confused, overwhelmed by the testing. She doesn't understand what she's saying." But then Sophie appeared in the doorway, flanked by a victim advocate and a child psychologist. When she saw Marcus, she broke free and ran to him, throwing her small arms around his waist. "Marcus, I told them the truth. I told them everything." Her voice was loud and clear and joyful. "I don't have to be quiet anymore." "Doctor." Reeves approached Marcus while Sophie clung to him. "Mr. Thompson, I understand you're the one who contacted Detective Hayes about this situation." "Yes, ma'am. That little girl has perfect hearing. Not only is she not deaf, she has exceptionally acute auditory processing abilities. What's been done to her constitutes severe psychological abuse." Dr. Reeves's voice was filled with professional outrage. "She's been living in an artificially created sensory deprivation environment for 6 years. Marcus looked down at Sophie, who was chattering excitedly to anyone who would listen, as if making up for years of enforced silence. "What happens to her now?" "Emergency custody hearing this afternoon. Sophie will be placed in protective care while the investigation continues." Dr. Reeves paused. "She's going to need extensive therapy to overcome the psychological damage, but children are remarkably resilient. With proper support, she can have a normal life." As the legal and medical teams prepared to leave with Sophie, she turned back to Marcus one more time. "Thank you for seeing me," she said simply. "Thank you for knowing I was there." Marcus knelt down and hugged her one final time. "You were always there, sweetheart. You just needed someone to listen." Drandy, as the convoy of official vehicles pulled away from the Richardson mansion, taking Sophie toward her new life, Marcus realized that sometimes the smallest acts of courage, really seeing a child who had been rendered invisible, could change everything. But even as he watched Sophie leave, he sensed that the biggest revelations were still to come. Because in a case involving $50 million, powerful people and elaborate deceptions, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. 3 weeks after Sophie's rescue from the Richardson mansion, Marcus Thompson sat in a coffee shop across from Detective Hayes, struggling to process information that defied everything he thought he understood about the case. "Mr. Thompson, what I'm about to tell you must remain confidential until the trial. We've uncovered evidence that changes everything we thought we knew about Sophie Richardson." Marcus set down his coffee cup, his hands suddenly unsteady. "What kind of evidence?" Detective Hayes opened a manila folder and extracted several documents. DNA testing, birth records, and medical files that Patricia Richardson thought were sealed forever. He looked directly at Marcus. "Sophie Richardson is not Patricia Richardson's biological daughter." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. "What?" "Sophie was born to Patricia's younger sister, Michelle Richardson, who died in a car accident when Sophie was 6 months old. Michelle had named Patricia as Sophie's guardian. But there's more." Detective Hayes pulled out another document. "Michelle's daughter was born with perfect hearing and normal development. But when Patricia took custody, she also inherited something else, Michelle's share of their mother's estate, which included the $50 million trust fund." Marcus felt the puzzle pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. So Patricia created Sophie's disability to access the trust money that was legally Sophie's inheritance. Exactly, but it gets worse. We found medical records that Patricia falsified, showing that Sophie had suffered hearing loss due to childhood meningitis. Dr. Sterling was initially brought in as a legitimate specialist, but over time, she became complicit in the deception. The financial payments from the trust fund were too lucrative to resist. Detective Hayes pulled out photographs that made Marcus's stomach turn. "These are surveillance photos from Patricia's home security system, which we subpoenaed. They show Patricia conducting training sessions with Sophie, teaching her to ignore sounds and respond only to visual cues. Some of these sessions lasted for hours." Marcus studied the images. A tiny girl, barely 2 years old, sitting motionless while her guardian created elaborate sound distractions. The psychological conditioning had started when Sophie was so young that she barely remembered a time when she was allowed to hear and speak naturally. How did Patricia explain Sophie's perfect signing skills to Dr. Sterling? That's the most disturbing part. Dr. Sterling knew Sophie could hear from the beginning. The sessions weren't therapy, they were rehearsals. Dr. Sterling was coaching Sophie to maintain the deception while documenting her progress for the trust administrators. Marcus thought about all those therapy sessions he'd observed, the mechanical precision of Sophie's responses, the way both adults had worked to isolate her from any outside contact that might expose the truth. "Mr. Thompson, there's something else you need to know. Sophie's real name isn't Sophie Richardson." Marcus looked up sharply. "What?" "Who? Her birth certificate lists her as Emma Michelle Richardson. Patricia changed her name when she took custody, claiming it was to honor their deceased mother, Elizabeth. But we think it was to further obscure Sophie's true identity and make it harder for anyone to trace her original medical records. Emma, the same name as Marcus's own daughter. The coincidence felt surreal. Where is Sophie now? She's in foster care with a family that specializes in helping children who've experienced severe psychological trauma. She's making remarkable progress. She's been enrolled in regular second grade, she's receiving counseling, and for the first time in her life, she's learning what it means to be a normal 7-year-old. Detective Hayes closed the folder. Patricia Richardson has been charged with fraud, child abuse, and theft. Dr. Sterling is cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. The trust fund will be restructured to provide for Sophie's actual needs: education, therapy, and a normal childhood. Marcus felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Sophie had endured. "Can I see her? Actually, she's been asking about you. Her foster family would like to meet the man who saved her life." 2 days later, Marcus sat in a bright, cheerful living room belonging to David and Sarah Chen, no relation to the CPS worker, a couple who had spent 15 years fostering children from traumatic situations. Sophie ran into the room wearing a yellow sundress, her blonde hair in pigtails, looking like any other 7-year-old girl. But it was her voice that took Marcus's breath away. "Marcus! Marcus, look what I can do!" Sophie practically bounced with excitement as she pulled out a school project. "I wrote a story about a little girl who finds her voice. Mrs. Patterson, my teacher, said it's the best story in the whole class." Marcus knelt down to examine her work, marveling at the animated child before him. This was the real Sophie, bright, talkative, curious, and utterly alive. "Tell me about your story, sweetheart." "Well, there's this little girl who lived in a castle where she wasn't allowed to make any noise, but then a friendly giant helped her escape, and she discovered that she had the most beautiful singing voice in the world." Sophie looked up at Marcus with shining eyes. "The friendly giant is you, Marcus. You helped me find my voice." Sarah Chen joined them, smiling warmly. "Sophie talks about you constantly, Mr. Thompson. You're her hero." Over the next hour, Marcus watched Sophie demonstrate her remarkable resilience. She chatted about school, her new friends, the songs she was learning in music class, and her dreams of becoming a teacher when she grew up. The silent, trapped child he'd first encountered was gone, replaced by this vibrant little girl who seemed determined to make up for 6 years of enforced quiet. "Marcus," Sophie said as their visit was coming to an end, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why did you save me? You didn't even know me." Marcus thought about the question, remembering that first moment when he'd noticed Sophie's subtle response to sound, the way his parental instincts had recognized a child in distress. "Because every child deserves to be heard, Sophie. And because sometimes adults forget that children are people too, with their own thoughts and feelings and dreams. I could see that you had something important to say, and I wanted to make sure someone was listening." Sophie hugged him tightly. "I'm going to help other kids like me when I grow up, kids who need someone to listen." As Marcus drove home that evening, he reflected on how a simple cleaning job had led him into the center of a conspiracy that had stolen a child's voice for 6 years. He thought about the courage it had taken for Sophie to finally speak the truth, and the incredible strength she'd shown in rebuilding her life. His phone rang as he pulled into his apartment complex. It was Emma, "Daddy, how was your visit with the little girl?" "It was wonderful, sweetheart. She's doing really well. I'm glad you helped her, Daddy. Everyone deserves to have someone who listens to them." Marcus smiled, struck once again by his daughter's wisdom. "You're absolutely right, Emma." 6 months later, Marcus received an invitation to Sophie's adoption ceremony. David and Sarah Chen had officially adopted her, giving her the loving, stable family she deserved. The invitation was written in Sophie's careful 7-year-old handwriting. "Dear Marcus, you are invited to my adoption party. I'm getting a real family who will never ask me to be quiet. I'm going to keep the name Sophie because that's who I am now. But I also want to honor my birth mommy, Michelle. My new middle name will be Michelle. Thank you for helping me become Sophie Michelle Chen. Love, your friend Sophie." At the ceremony, Marcus watched Sophie stand before the judge, speaking clearly and confidently about her excitement to join her new family. Her voice, strong, joyful, and completely her own, filled the courtroom with hope. As the judge declared the adoption official, Sophie looked directly at Marcus and smiled. In that moment, he realized that sometimes the most important thing you can do for another person is simply to see them, really see them, and refuse to look away until they're safe. Sophie Richardson had found her voice, and in helping her speak, Marcus Thompson had discovered his own capacity for courage he never knew he possessed. The trust fund that had been used to silence Sophie was restructured to support other children who had been victims of similar abuse. Dr. Sterling lost her license and served 2 years in prison. Patricia Richardson was sentenced to 10 years for fraud and child abuse. But Sophie Michelle Chen was free to be loud, curious, talkative, and gloriously unapologetically herself. And somewhere in the suburban mansion where she'd once lived in enforced silence, the rooms echoed with emptiness, a reminder that the greatest wealth isn't money in a trust fund, but the sound of a child's laughter filling a home with love.